My 13th birthday was June 6, 1944, and the machine shop where I worked had a clandestine radio, and we heard Radio Free Europe, the BBC, announcing that the Normandy invasion had started. My birthday present was to hear the ta-ta-ta-tum of the call of the Radio Free Europe, and then the announcement.
Our grandfather told us about the landing in Normandy. He would lay out a checker cloth on his table, red checkers for the Allies and black checkers for the German positions. And he would outline the Normandy landing. Whenever we ended, he would always say, well, don't tell any of your friends.
All of a sudden, there's a lot of people in the streets, hugging, kissing, dancing, jumping of joy. It was unreal. It was incredible. And that's when I found out the fantastic news. The Americans had just landed in Normandy. It was the end of a nightmare. I'll never forget this as long as I live.
Tomorrow marks 80 years since D-Day, a pivotal moment in the Allies' victory over Nazi Germany, which ultimately led to the end of the Holocaust. You've just heard from Holocaust survivors who vividly recall learning of the Allies landing in France. The news of the Allied invasion brought them a renewed sense of hope amidst the horrors and threats that they endured. Thank you for joining us as we honor this important anniversary. I'm Dr. Lindsay McNeil, a historian at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Tonight, we will discuss the significance of this invasion and the role it played in the liberation of millions of innocent people persecuted by the Nazi regime. We're going to introduce you to a D-Day veteran and a Holocaust survivor and discuss how their lives were shaped by this history. Joining me tonight are two special guests, my colleague at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and a curator of our special exhibition, Americans in the Holocaust, historian Dr. Becky Erbelding. Hi, Becky.
Hi, Lindsay.
Becky, could you tell us a little bit about the museum for our viewers who might not be familiar with our work?
Absolutely. So the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is located in Washington, D.C., and it is a museum dedicated to documenting, studying, and ensuring the relevance of Holocaust history. We use the power of personal stories and artifacts to educate people around the world about the history of the Holocaust. And that is a history that raises questions about choice, about human behavior, and about our roles in society today.
Thanks, Becky. I'd also like to welcome the senior historian at Arlington National Cemetery, Dr. Allison Finkelstein. Hi, Allison.
Hi, Lindsay. Thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm really honored to be able to join the museum to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the D-Day invasion. I work at Arlington National Cemetery, or ANC for short. We were founded in 1864 during the American Civil War as a place to bury soldiers who died in nearby Washington, D.C. area hospitals. Though forged in the horrors of the Civil War, over the past 160 years, ANC has evolved into a unique, multi-layered site of memory known worldwide. Our rolling hills are now filled with the graves of service members and their families, members from every time period in American history, from the American Revolution through today. Memorials and monuments honor many aspects of our nation's military past, and the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier stands as a sacred site of pilgrimage honoring America's missing and unidentified war dead. This year, we are actually commemorating the 160th anniversary of the cemetery's creation, and tonight's program is an important part of that commemoration. And I just have to add that this program is really very personally meaningful to me as well. My own grandfather, Louis Finkelstein, was wounded on June 6th during the D-Day invasion, and I'm really grateful to have the chance to speak a little bit about him later tonight.
Thanks so much, Allison. Tonight's program is really special because it brings together our two institutions and their missions. Both of the men we will honor tonight have a connection to Holocaust history, and both are laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. Before we get started, just a quick note to viewers. We'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. Feel free to message us in the chat. And you can also ask any questions related to the program there as well. We'll get to as many as we can by the end of our conversation. Okay, Becky, I want to start with you. Before we get to D-Day and the United States' role in the 1944 invasion, we need to understand the context for Americans at the time. Let's go back to 1933, before World War II, when the Nazis rose to power in Germany. What was life like for Americans?
Well, as the Nazis are coming to power in Germany in 1933, Americans are really grappling with a lot of their own problems. 1933 is the fourth year of the Great Depression. An estimated 25% of the American workforce is unemployed. You can see a line here of people waiting for food. And there's seemingly no end in sight. So Americans are really optimistic about the new Roosevelt administration. Franklin Roosevelt becomes president in March 1933, only 6 weeks after Hitler is appointed chancellor. But things are really bad in the United States. This is also a society in which racism and anti-Semitism is really common. There are a lot of colleges and social clubs that forbid Jews from becoming members. Many states are racially segregated, either by law or in other areas, they're segregated through redlining and through quieter methods. Even the US military at the time is racially segregated. And the US is also very anti-immigrant at this time. In the 1920s, Congress, on a bipartisan basis, had passed new immigration laws. And these laws were based in these ideas of racism and anti-Semitism and prejudice. And they were meant to keep the country white and Protestant for the future by encouraging immigration from countries which had large white Protestant populations and providing fewer immigration opportunities for countries with large Catholic and Jewish and non-white populations. And so all of these factors led the United States to be really quite isolationist from the rest of the world, not wanting to get involved. The country is very, very far from becoming a superpower and is really grappling with a lot of things.
So it's a complicated time in American history. And what's going on in Germany in the early 1930s? And what did Americans know about what was happening there?
I mean, obviously, it's a difficult time in Germany too, but the Nazi Party is promising a lot of hope. So Germany had also been struggling with its own crisis. They lost the First World War, and then were in a severe economic depression after that war. And then they got caught up in the global Great Depression that began in the late 1920s. After Germany's defeat in World War I and the punitive Treaty of Versailles, that many Germans were looking for someone to blame for their seeming loss in stature. And the Nazi Party was very quick to point its finger always at Jews, scapegoating them as the source of many of the country's woes. So after Adolf Hitler, the head of the Nazi Party, was appointed chancellor in January 1933, the Nazis quickly, in the spring of 1933, began to enact anti-Semitic measures targeting German Jews, including a nationwide boycott of all Jewish-owned businesses throughout the country. This was followed in the spring of 1933 by a series of discriminatory laws that attempted to drive Jews virtually out of all aspects of life in Germany. And the Nazis hoped that all of these laws would eventually drive Jews out of the country itself. This was not a secret in the United States. You can see in this photo that the caption in the boycott photo is in English. There are newspaper articles. This is not something secret. I think we look back and we think that Americans only learned about the Nazi hatred of Jews at Liberation in 1945, and that is not true. These new laws and the boycott and book burning are front page news in the United States, right next to news of the New Deal and about the end of Prohibition. In fact, there are enough American reporters on the ground in Nazi Germany that often some of these events, like the boycott and like book burning, are actually reported in American newspapers in advance of them actually happening. And as Americans are protesting the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany, they're reading these articles, and Americans are showing up at rallies, at marches. They're sending petitions to the US government to ask them to do something to get the Nazis to stop. All of that is happening in the spring of 1933. But like many protest movements, it's hard to sustain. And by the summer of 1933, those protests start to die out. 5 years later, in November 1938, Nazi leaders unleash a nationwide wave of violence against Jews that will become known as Kristallnacht. The news of Kristallnacht, like the early laws, made the front page of newspapers throughout the United States. It was front page news for about 3 weeks here. And these attacks exacerbated an ongoing refugee crisis. Jews who were still in Germany, which now included parts of Czechoslovakia and Austria, which the Nazis had annexed, are desperately trying to flee. And Americans are looking at this crisis and they're concerned about the violence. They consider it a terror attack against the Jews of Germany. But they're also saying that we as Americans do not want any more Jewish refugees. Those strict immigration laws that I mentioned were still in place. They were not revised. And the US had no refugee or asylum policy at all. Most Americans are still isolationists. They are unwilling to get involved in any sort of international affairs. And that is a bipartisan position.
I think a lot of our viewers are probably going to be quite surprised to learn just how much Americans knew about what was going on in Nazi Germany. And now, Allison, I want to turn to you to tell us a little bit more about a specific person's experience. As Becky just told us, Kristallnacht was a turning point for many German Jews. Could you introduce us to someone who experienced it firsthand? Tell us about Eddie Willner.
I am really honored to be able to tell the story of Eddie Willner. His son Al and his daughter Nina are family friends of mine, and it's really meaningful to share the story of what Eddie went through during World War II and also how he eventually built his life here in the United States. Eddie was born with the name Helmut Wilner in 1926 in Germany. When the Nazis came to power, his father Siegfried initially believed that his family would be safe. Like many other Jews in Germany, he had served honorably in the First World War in the German army, and he thought that his service would help safeguard his family. But Siegfried soon realized that despite his service in the Great War, Germany was truly becoming unsafe for Jews. Kristallnacht was the tipping point for Eddie and his family, as it was for so many other Jews. They knew at that point that they needed to get out of Germany. Through the help of a Jewish refugee organization, Eddie's father, Siegfried, was able to send Eddie out of Germany to Brussels, Belgium, where he hoped that Eddie would be safer. Eddie was placed with a Jewish family living in Belgium. There was a lot of anti-German sentiment there at the time, and even though Eddie was a German Jewish refugee escaping Nazi persecution, Helmut is a very German name, so he was given the nickname Eddie instead. That nickname stuck, and he went by Eddie since the time that he was about 12 years old, and it's actually the name that is inscribed on his headstone at Arlington National Cemetery. Months later, Eddie's parents also arrived in Belgium. They had to leave everything behind in Germany, and they lived in one small room in Brussels. It wasn't big enough for Eddie to live with them, so Eddie stayed with the host family, and he visited his parents on the weekends. Despite these circumstances, it was still a meaningful reunion for the family. What they did not know at the time was that their time together in Belgium would be the last almost peaceful moments they would ever spend together as a family.
Because, of course, what they couldn't know is that in September 1939, nearly a year after Kristallnacht and after the Wilners have made it to Belgium, World War II began when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. And initially, Eddie and his family are fine, right? They're far away. But we know that this changes several months later in May 1940, when Nazi Germany invaded Belgium, France, and other neighboring countries. What happens to the Wilners?
The story of the Wilner family is quite incredible and rather complex at times. After the German invasion of Belgium, the Belgian government rounded up and interned German men as enemy aliens. That even included Jewish refugees like Siegfried, Eddie's father. He was sent to an internment camp in southern France. Eddie and his mother went searching for his father. All they knew was that Siegfried was somewhere in southern France. But Eddie and his mother were arrested crossing the border, and they were also imprisoned as enemy aliens. They were later released, and they continued to try to locate Eddie's father. Eventually, they found him, and the family was briefly reunited. In 1942, they heard rumors about Jews being sent away by the Nazis to unknown destinations, maybe concentration camps. The family found shelter with a priest who housed Jewish refugees, all of whom were trying to avoid both the Nazis as well as their French collaborators. France really was not a safe place for Jews at that time. Eventually, it was the French police who discovered and arrested Eddie's and his family. They sent them to Drancy, a transit camp outside of Paris.
Thanks so much, Allison. I can only imagine how terrifying it must have been to have fled Nazi Germany and then to find yourself once again back in danger from the Nazis. Before we keep going with the program, I want to stop to welcome viewers watching from around the country and North America. Hello to viewers in Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Miami Beach, Florida, Phoenix, Arizona, San Francisco, California, and Toronto, Canada. Thanks so much for watching tonight. And I know, Allison, that we'll come back to the rest of Eddie's story a little bit later, but I want to add some context here. Nazi Germany was not only waging war across Europe, it was also intensifying its persecution of Jews. Eventually, this escalated to a policy of mass murder. Beginning in the summer of 1941, the Nazis and their allies and collaborators began systematically killing Jewish men, women, and children in mass shooting operations, which you can see a photograph of here. Later, the Nazis created killing centers specifically to murder Jews using poison gas. And what's really important to remember here is that this is happening under the cover of war. We talked earlier about how much news there was in the 1930s about what was going on in Nazi Germany. But once the Nazis begin to commit mass murder, they're trying to cover up what they're doing. They don't want everyone to know about their crimes. And people, including Americans, don't have a full picture of what's happening. And for more than 2 years of the war, from September 1939 to December 1941, the US was officially neutral. Then on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. In response, America declared war on Japan, and then Japan's allies, Germany and Italy, declared war on the United States. Becky, what did the early stages of America's involvement in World War II look like?
Well, in the first full year of the war, so 1942, the American military and the American people are mostly focused on the Pacific Front and on the fight against Japan. Young men are being drafted and sent to training camps, and women are volunteering for women's units and going to work in factories to produce for the Allied militaries. Rationing begins, and the home front is completely changed by the war. 1942 is really spent building up manpower and supplies in advance of what they know will be a really difficult ground and air fight against Germany and against its Axis partners in Europe. And in November 1942, those ground troops faced their first real challenge in what was called the European theater. The US participates in Operation Torch, which was the Allied invasion of North Africa. This was America's first major ground operation against Nazi Germany. And at this point, they are hundreds of miles away from the Nazi killing centers where most people were being murdered. Only a few weeks after that invasion of North Africa began, so still in 1942, in November, Americans and the American public learned for the first time that the Nazis have a plan to kill all European Jews. So as you said, while mass killing had been going on for more than a year, there weren't American journalists on the ground reporting back all of this information firsthand. And so there had been rumors in American newspapers of mass shootings or of certain towns being wiped out in Eastern Europe. But Americans, particularly before Pearl Harbor, when the US was still officially neutral, Americans had been really quick to dismiss that as just a rumor, as anti-Nazi propaganda, as just a way to pressure the American people and the United States to get involved in the war. But by November 1942, and from then on, the idea that the Nazis are rounding up and deporting European Jews and trying to kill them all was something that was treated as fact by American newspapers. So November 1942, for many reasons, is a real turning point here.
So in the first year of the U.S. entering the war, the U.S. is really focused on getting the manpower and building the material it needs to fight. I'd like to hear more about one American soldier in particular. Allison, could you tell us about James Milner Roberts Jr.? How did he find himself joining the Army?
James Milner Roberts Jr. was born in Pittsburgh after World War I, and he went by his middle name Milner, so that's how I'm going to refer to him throughout our program. His father had served in the U.S. Army during World War I, which inspired Milner to follow in his footsteps. Milner commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Reserve in May of 1940, and remember, that was even before the United States had entered World War II. But a week after the Pearl Harbor attack, he received orders that he would be serving as a weapons instructor. By June of 1943, he applied to the Airborne and was accepted for service. After training, he was deployed to England just 3 months before the D-Day invasion. Milner was earmarked to be part of the 101st Airborne Division. When he arrived, he helped with preparations for the upcoming invasion. At the time, the invasion was known by the code name Operation Overlord. It would be key to the Allies' strategy to win the war and attempt to reach Berlin. military leaders felt strongly that another front in Europe was a necessity for combating Germany after the Nazi invasion of France.
And so D-Day, of course, is quite well known, right? It's the largest amphibious invasion in US military history. It was key to the Western Allies' victory over Nazi Germany. And many of us have seen powerful depictions of the battle, from Saving Private Ryan to Band of Brothers. But Milner was there. What exactly did he experience?
Leading up to D-Day, Milner was slated to fly a glider plane during the operation. Glider planes were a truly terrifying and nerve-wracking piece of equipment. They were essentially an engineless airplane made out of wood and fabric that were meant to transport troops and equipment. They really weren't so different from little wooden toy airplanes. Milner actually recalled how he was not looking forward to flying over the English Channel in a glider. But just 5 days before the invasion, he was reassigned to be the tactical aide to the commander of the Omaha Beach landing, General Leonard Giroux, who is also buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Giroux needed Milner's ability to read photo maps, which he had gained through his glider training. Now, for those who don't know, during the Allied invasion of Normandy, the 5 beaches that the Allies landed on were each given code names: Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword, and Utah. Each of the Allied invasion forces landed on different beaches. The United States landed on Omaha Beach and Utah Beach. Milner talked about his experience on D-Day in an interview recorded with the Holocaust Museum in 1992. Let's take a listen.
I landed on D-Day with elements of the 16th Infantry of the 1st Division, right in the middle of Omaha Beach. It was called the Easy Red Section. Well, in a way it was a misnomer from the point of being easy, but from the point of view of being red, it had something along that line.
The Easy Red sector was part of the main battleground area on Omaha Beach, and it was where the Germans focused most of their efforts and resources. Omaha was the most heavily defended of the 5 beaches the Allies landed on. Milner's recollection of how the waters seemed to turn red during the invasion, it's emblematic of the heavy casualties sustained that day. If anybody has ever had the opportunity to visit the Normandy American Cemetery in France, it is located on the high bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach. Looking out from the cemetery, it is clear how difficult the fighting must have been that day. But despite the obstacles they faced, the U.S. and its allies were able to push the German forces back and claim the beaches. But by the end of the day, Allied troops suffered more than 10,000 casualties, with 4,400 confirmed dead. More than 2,500 of those deaths were Americans, many unidentified. Omaha Beach saw the highest number of casualties, but Milner was one of the lucky ones who survived. And in the days after the landing, he and his fellow soldiers were stuck in what he described as a stalemate in an area of hedgerows. These were thick shrubs that served as a natural barrier that the Germans used to their advantage to try to shut out the Allied forces. Every day, Milner and a group of soldiers would go out on a patrol of the hedgerow areas and report back on what they saw so they could strategize about how to break the German line. Allied troops were not trained in hedgerow combat, so these patrols were particularly dangerous and deadly. Yet, they were eventually successful in breaking through in July of 1944.
I'd like to remind our viewers, please send your questions for Becky and Allison. And on that note, Allison, I have a bit of a more personal question for you right now. You mentioned at the top of the show that your grandfather served on D-Day. Could you tell us a little bit about what he experienced?
Yes, thank you, Lindsay, so much for bringing that up. My grandfather, Louis Finkelstein, was also on Omaha Beach on June 6th, 1944, and there's a picture of him outside of a Quonset hut in Scotland doing his pre-invasion training. I was really close to my grandpa, and I had the opportunity to record an oral history of his service, which is now at the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. My dad also did an oral history of him in the 1990s, which was donated to what is now called the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and it was actually used by Stephen Ambrose in his book about D-Day. In these oral histories, my dad and I learned harrowing details about my grandpa's D-Day experience. He served in the Navy as a seaman gunner on an LCVP. That stands for Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel. These were also known as Higgins boats. They were the small landing craft that transported shoaled soldiers onto the beaches. The fronts of them opened up to create a ramp for departure onto the beach or into the waves. My grandpa was one of the sailors manning an LCVP as it transported soldiers to the shore or as close as they could get. He was assigned to Omaha Beach, actually most likely the Easy Red sector like Wilner, although it's hard to be certain where he actually landed because of how much the landing craft may have drifted that day. My grandpa Lou recalled that he was taking in elements of the 29th Infantry Division. They encountered heavy fire as they neared the beaches, as well as obstacles in the water itself. They did successfully make one landing, dropping off the soldiers before turning around to attempt a second landing. But on the way back, they hit a mine, as far as my grandpa knew, and he was wounded. He passed out, he was picked up by a hospital ship, and he was taken to a hospital in Southampton, England to recover. And after he recovered, he returned to duty. He served for the remainder of the war, even helping to capture a ship in Bremerhaven, Germany, as well as staying on for occupation duty. My grandpa lived with the physical effects of that wound for the rest of his life. He endured frequent pain in his leg. He would tell us as children he could feel the piece of shrapnel going up and down his leg. The war, and especially the invasion, had haunted him. He did not talk about it a lot with my grandma, and he really only started to open up more about it to my dad in the 1990s and later to me after I graduated from college. And here's a picture of my grandpa and grandma with my sister and I at William and Mary. Toward the end of his life, my grandpa joined a support group at his local VA where he started to process some of the PTSD he had dealt with his entire life. Some pretty upsetting stories came out about what he saw that day, about the fellow sailor he lost when they were hit, how he was trying to grab his hand to bring him back onto the boat and lived with that for the rest of his life. But like so many other World War II veterans, he had struggled for a long time in silence. And despite being proud of his service, my grandpa was also humble. But what he always talked about was how he was proud to serve as a Jewish American sailor, that he was out there. He understood what this war was about. He was fighting for his nation. He was fighting for his people, and he was not afraid to tell that to the German POWs that he encountered when he finally did get back into the war.
Allison, I think I speak for many of our viewers when I say how extraordinarily special it is to hear you share not only your extensive knowledge of D-Day, but also your personal connection and your grandfather's story.
Thank you.
I'd like to also share a comment from a viewer named Larry. Larry writes, "My tremendous gratitude to all those who served in World War II and sacrificed their lives for the benefit of others. If not for these brave and passionate soldiers, I would not be here today." And of course, we know that for many of these soldiers, D-Day was kind of a beginning point, right? Not the end. They still had to fight their way into the German front line and across Europe. And D-Day also did not immediately end the suffering of Jews and other victims of the Nazis. By June 6, 1944, the Nazis and their allies and collaborators had already murdered more than 5 million European Jews. And Nazi authorities would continue to murder Jews until the final days of World War II. But the Allied invasion of France and the subsequent victories likely saved hundreds of thousands of Jews in Western and Central Europe from being murdered in the Holocaust. I think that really ties back to what you said about your grandfather, that he was proud to tell these POWs, right, that he was Jewish, that he knew what he was fighting for and against. Becky, can you zoom out for a minute and give us a sense of the landscape of the war after D-Day?
Of course. So, as you said, the Allied troops still have a really long way to go in terms of geography and fighting before Jews and other victims of the Nazis are liberated. And there are really a few key points and events to note here. In the European theater, there are multiple fronts being fought, right? There's the front that opens up thanks to D-Day, which is thousands of miles from the Nazi killing centers. By June 1944, the Allied forces had pushed the Germans and Italians out of North Africa, and they had invaded first Italy in September 1943, first Sicily in September 1943, and then they moved on to the mainland of Italy. And in fact, Allied troops took Rome, liberated Rome the day before D-Day, which was an important victory and something that Americans were celebrating when they started to get news that the D-Day invasion had begun. And you also have the Eastern Front, where you have the Soviet Red Army slowly beating the Germans back west towards Germany. Many of the killing centers and concentration camps are Nazi-occupied Poland and Germany, and so Soviet troops are closer to reaching them at this point than the American and British troops are. And these fronts are all trying to defeat the Nazi forces. They're all trying to liberate territory, and they're all trying to make it to Germany's capital of Berlin. And as the fronts push that German line back, the Nazis are still actively persecuting and killing Jews and other groups. So as the Nazis are being pushed back into Germany, they are likewise moving their prisoners, Jewish and other forced laborers, back from the front lines of the war and further inland towards the center of Germany to continue their brutality against them and eke out the last bits of labor from these poor people in the hopes of turning the tide of the war.
Thanks, Becky. It's so important that even as we commemorate D-Day, we keep the bigger picture of the war and the Holocaust in mind. Can you now take us through the next year of the war for Wilner and other Americans who survived D-Day?
Well, in August 1944, so we're now a little more than 2 months after the invasion at Normandy, the Allies liberate Paris. And James Milner Roberts is there. He's part of that effort, and he witnesses all of the joy and the celebrations in the city. And I think he probably, and many Americans, thought at that point that the war would be over by the end of the year and that German defeat was imminent from then on. But there is a last-ditch effort by Germany and German forces in the middle of December 1944 that becomes known as the Battle of the Bulge. This was a counteroffensive located in the dense Ardennes forest between Belgium and Luxembourg. And you can see in this picture how snowy and cold it was. The Germans were trying to create a bulge. They were trying to push through the Allies' front lines and divide the army in two as a way of pushing the Allies backwards towards the coast. They were desperately trying to secure some kind of victory, any kind of victory, against all of the losses that Germany had been mounting. It takes more than a month of heavy fighting in the brutal cold, but finally the German troops failed, and it ultimately became a really decisive Allied victory. It was a massive battle. There were more than 600,000 American troops involved, including James Milner Roberts. This victory is really crucial in the Western Allies' advance towards Germany in the spring of 1945.
So, Becky, we also know that 10 months after landing in Normandy and almost 3 months after their important victory in the Battle of the Bulge, U.S. service members liberated the Buchenwald concentration camp in April 1945. We also know that American troops were deeply disturbed and in disbelief at what they witnessed. And among those witnesses was Milner. What was his exact experience?
Well, as you said, Lindsay, this was absolutely unbelievable to most of the American troops when they witnessed Buchenwald and the other camps that they liberated. It was unbelievable, and it was really upsetting. And in fact, it was so unbelievable that many soldiers took it upon themselves to try to document these crimes. They took photos, they wrote letters home describing in great detail what they saw. And General Eisenhower, as our viewers may know, encouraged this. He feared that Nazi atrocities might otherwise be someday chalked up to propaganda. And so we know that these young soldiers, directed by Eisenhower, created important evidence of the horrors of the Nazi regime, evidence that you and I use in our work all the time. When American troops liberated Buchenwald, Milner was miles away, but he heard about it, and he heard rumors of the camp, and he decided he had to go see it for himself. So 2 days after liberation, he went on his own accord because he too wanted to document what was happening. Decades later, he still remembered it. He remembered seeing piles of bodies as he wandered around the grounds. He saw the crematoria, and he realized there must have been thousands of bodies that were burned there. And he was struck by the sheer number of corpses in comparison to the number of survivors, which he described as living skeletons. A few days later, when he was back with his unit, they actually participated in a liberation. He liberated a camp himself, a subcamp of Buchenwald called Leipzig-Tekla. And what he saw there also affected him for the rest of his life. This was a particularly horrific liberation because the Nazis had realized that the American troops were closing in. And so they separated the prisoners into two groups. One group they sent on a forced march, and the other they gathered into a barracks and they burned the barracks. They burned the prisoners alive, and those who tried to escape were killed. Wilner and his unit arrived just too late. He said that he could still see the building smoldering when they got there. Decades later, he said he could not understand what had happened that day. And we have him talking about that in the oral history the museum recorded. Let's listen.
I couldn't believe what I was looking at. I should have by that time, but it's still hard to believe that humanity will do something like this. Particularly people who are disadvantaged, you put in and burn them alive. For what reason? It was obvious the war was virtually over. These people weren't going to do any damage to anybody. It has to take a very twisted mind to authorize and carry out something like this.
That is really one of the more horrific accounts of liberation that I've heard. And it just reminds you that the Nazis were dedicated to continuing this reign of brutality, even when it was clear that they had lost the war. And that when we're thinking about this from the perspective of Allied troops, every second counts in terms of saving people's lives as they're moving through Europe.
I also always reflect when I hear liberators give their testimony with how young they were at the time. I mean, they were 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, witnessing this and then grappling with it for the rest of their lives, inevitably with the traumatic stress disorder that Allison mentioned earlier. Wilner and his fellow liberators really felt strongly that this needed to be documented. And they were angry about what they saw. They decided that other people needed to witness the horror. And so they brought local townspeople, Germans, over to look at the evidence of what they had found at Leipzig-Tekla. And Wilner said that some of them fainted when they saw the scene. But these were German people who lived right near the camp and claimed to the American soldiers that they had no idea what was happening there. And Wilner, of course, did not believe them. He and the other soldiers buried the bodies. All the bodies that they could find in a cemetery in Leipzig, and they held a service for out of respect for the victims. And Wilner says that when he was organizing the service, it wasn't part of their official military duty, but he and his fellow soldiers felt a real moral responsibility to do this.
Allison, I want to come back to Eddie Willner, who we talked about earlier in our conversation. We've heard about the shock that so many of these troops like Wilner experienced when they discovered the camps. Eddie personally survived these horrors. What was he going through during the war?
We last left Eddie in 1942 when he and his family were imprisoned in the Drancy transit camp outside Paris. But they did not remain there for long. In September 1942, German authorities deported them on freight cars to Auschwitz-Birkenau, a killing center. These freight cars were packed with people. There was no food, little water, just a bucket to relieve oneself. Along the way, the train stopped in a town, and the German guards ordered those men capable of working to disembark the train. Now was the point when Siegfried and Eddie had to make a quick and consequential decision. They chose to disembark, and Eddie never saw his mother again. It's very likely that she was gassed upon arrival at Auschwitz, but her ultimate fate is still not known. Like so many other victims of the Holocaust, the details of her final moments and her fate are lost, leaving little trace of her death in the historical record. Eddie and his father were sent to forced labor camps nearby, where they did hard labor, building rail lines, digging up unexploded bombs, and constructing underground bunkers. They were given little food and clothing. Many prisoners died of exhaustion, starvation, and disease in these inhumane conditions. In the fall of 1944, Eddie's father grew very weak. Eddie returned from work one day and saw his father through the barbed wire. He prayed that his father wasn't being sent to the gas chamber at Auschwitz-Birkenau. But after that day, he never saw his father again. Another life lost without a trace. Through this painful moment, though, Eddie had a friend with him. At one of the camps, he had befriended Mike Swab, another boy his age who was Dutch. Years later, Eddie reflected on how important that friendship was for their mutual survival. Let's listen to Eddie in his own words.
We made a pact that we're going to stick it out together. We talked about it, and I said, we just have to help each other the best way we can. If you find some food, you share with me. I find some extra food, I share with you. And there has to be complete honesty, and we're going to get out. Never to leave that idea behind that we're not going to make it. We are going to make it. And it was the single biggest thing in my life, and I'm sure his life, that made me survive. Plus a lot of luck, plus a lot of faith, plus a lot of other things. But I think the idea that we're going to make it by escaping or some other way made us stay alive.
This friendship between Mike and Eddie, it saved both of their lives. Their pact, it helped them survive. It gave them something and someone to live for. They stayed friends for the rest of their lives, and Al Willner, Eddie's son, grew up calling Mike his Uncle Mike.
It's a sentiment we really hear a lot from Holocaust survivors. This shows up in a lot of testimony, that they credit luck, they credit circumstance, but they really credit friendship and relationships. You hear it from service members too, who are going through all of these horrific things, the importance of their comrades, of people who can pull them through. It's a really powerful piece of testimony.
It really is. So in January of 1945, the Soviet army was approaching Auschwitz, and the Germans decide to evacuate the camp. Eddie and Mike are sent on a death march and then on to several more camps. By April 1945, an exhausted Eddie and Mike are sent on another death march. But this time something rather remarkable happens. Allison, would you tell us about it?
Yes, while on this death march, Eddie and Mike overheard from the SS forces that the Americans were nearby. Eddie, Mike, and 4 other men decided to try to escape in a group. After 3 nights of marching, there was an airplane overhead which they used as a distraction to escape. The 6 men then decided to run in different directions. Eddie and Mike, of course, escaped together, and they were unsure of the fate of the other 4 men. Eddie and Mike's appearance, it made it obvious that they had escaped from some type of camp. They were tattooed, their heads were shaved, and they were covered with lice. And after several days on the run, they saw tanks and heard the German language being spoken. They put their hands up and discovered not a Nazi, but a German-American soldier, an interpreter. They had encountered an American tank company, D Company, 32nd Regiment of the 3rd Armored Division. This was a moment that changed the course of Eddie's life. The leader of the company, Lieutenant Elmer Hovland, decided to take Eddie and Mike in. He helped them get cleaned up, gave them uniforms, and fed them. When D Company found Eddie and Mike, they were about 18 years old, and they each only weighed around 75 pounds. The tankers helped them regain their health, and they gained about 50 pounds in 3 months. The war ended a few weeks later, and Eddie and Mike ended up spending 6 months with the tank company. You can see them here. These American soldiers had taken in these former prisoners, informally adopted them, really. They gave the boys the opportunity to survive, and they formed relationships with them that lasted the rest of their lives. It is this remarkable connection between people you wouldn't necessarily think would have this type of bond. In the midst of this horrific war, these American soldiers, they went above and beyond the call of duty to show kindness and empathy to 2 young boys who had suffered unspeakable tragedies. And of course, while Eddie and Mike survived, most victims of the Holocaust did not. Mike was not able to find any family after the war. Eddie lost both of his parents during the Holocaust, and at age 18, he had to try to rebuild his life. He immigrated to the United States in December of 1947, and Eddie was so inspired by the group of men who took him in from D Company that he volunteered for military service and served in the Army for 20 years. I mentioned earlier that Eddie's son, Al Willner, is a family friend of mine. We had the opportunity to speak with Al about his father's experiences for this webinar, which Al actually worked on with us. Let's hear from Al now.
The fact that these officers and men took them under the wing to bring them back to health, I think had a tremendous impact. I'm not sure he would have come to the United States had he not linked up with Company D. He was really grateful for the opportunity to have served. I think grateful for the opportunity to become a citizen of his adopted country. Just the fact that he was able to kind of start a new life, with my mother, and then I have 5 brothers and sisters. I think that obviously he was eternally grateful to the country for giving him that opportunity and the people that made it happen.
It's really such an inspiring story.
It really is. And it's so nice to get to hear him talk about his father and his service in the military. And I'm sure, Allison, even more for you, since you know him personally.
Oh, it absolutely is. Al has done a lot of research on his family history, as has his sister Nina, who's a writer. And a few years ago, Al actually did a pilgrimage entirely on foot, during which he retraced his father's death march and other aspects of his survival story. Right now, he is back in Europe with his children, his nieces, and his nephews. He is taking them to these sites on a pilgrimage to places that are so important to their family's very existence and survival. And that's why Al couldn't join us tonight. But the impact of those tankers' lifeline to Eddie and Mike, it created several new generations of Americans in the Wilner family who served the United States in the military, the government, and other capacities. And it's just incredible how Eddie's experiences continue to live on through his children and his grandchildren. What a legacy.
Absolutely. And it's not just this history that unites Eddie and Milner. We know that both J. Milner Roberts and Eddie Willner are buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Allison, what does it mean to honor these veterans in one of our country's most sacred grounds?
It means so much. Many people, they think of ANC as primarily a burial ground for those killed in action or for the graves of President John F. Kennedy, famous generals, admirals, and Medal of Honor recipients. And while important, these graves are just one aspect of Arlington's history. Arlington is also the final resting place for thousands of lesser-known American service members and their families, all of whom have fascinating stories waiting to be told. At Arlington, our history team likes to say that we can tell the entire history of our nation within our boundary walls. We have many stories that people may not expect to find here. We have the graves of at least 11 Holocaust survivors, both those who served in the military and those who did not. We have the graves of dozens of service members and civilians who liberated or were involved in the liberation of the concentration camps, people who witnessed the evidence of the Holocaust firsthand. We also have the graves of formerly enslaved Americans, of freed people who tried to build a new life during and just after the Civil War, of leaders in the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, and the efforts for American Indians to gain citizenship rights. I could go on and on. At Arlington, we can truly touch upon stories that are relevant to every American, no matter their background or their interests. And today's program is really evidence of that. We have this opportunity to collaborate with folks like you guys at the Holocaust Museum to share these stories and tell everybody that they are all welcome at Arlington National Cemetery. And this is particularly important for educators. We have an education program, and in our World War II module, we have an entire lesson plan about Eddie Willner. So the opportunity to amplify his story, share those materials, and collaborate with you all at the Holocaust Museum during the 80th anniversary of D-Day and the 160th anniversary of the cemetery, it's such a privilege, and we're just so grateful. Thank you.
I have been so fascinated to learn more about Arlington National Cemetery from you and about these connections between Holocaust history and the cemetery. It's been really wonderful getting to learn more about it. Becky, the museum has preserved stories, Eddie's, Milner's, along with those of many other survivors and victims and liberators. How does the museum serve as a place to remember those who may not have their own resting place?
It's as you said, it's been really meaningful for the museum to work with Arlington National Cemetery as well. And as Allison showed, Eddie Willner and J. Milner Roberts have gravestones. They have a place in Arlington where you can visit and you can lay flowers and you can honor their memory. But if you listen to the story, you know that people like Eddie and Mike's parents, they don't have a resting place. Eddie and Mike never learned what happened to their families. And so the museum collects these stories and artifacts and testimonies and works to memorialize the experiences of millions of people, many of whom do not have a gravestone. That is one of the missions of the museum, to try to act as that place of a memorial of memory and as a way to collect and learn so that we can continue to honor the victims and survivors of the Holocaust and to help our visitors learn more about how and why something like the Holocaust could happen.
Thank you both. I think it's time for us to turn to some questions from our audience. And Becky, this first one I think is for you. Chantel asked about the forced marches or the death marches that we talked about earlier. They'd like to know what ends up being the fate of the prisoners who are led on these different death marches in general. So we heard about Eddie and Mike, but what generally happens?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends a lot on when we're talking about and where we're talking about. So some of the forced marches, for example, from Auschwitz in January 1945, when the Auschwitz killing center is evacuated, those prisoners are being sent to Germany and often to other camps or work sites where they are subjected to even more forced labor. But in the spring of 1945, in April, many people are just sent walking. You know, the Germans don't want them to be liberated. And so they just set out, sometimes by train and sometimes by foot. Some are killed in this, with the story that you heard about Leipzig Tekla, but many are liberated by American troops or by Red Cross personnel on the roads, in columns, often very weak and not in any place where they've had food or rest for a very long time.
And Becky, I have another question for you, which is, did any Holocaust survivors serve on D-Day?
Yes, they did. The museum defines Holocaust survivors as people who were persecuted by Nazi Germany and its allies and collaborators, which includes people who were in Germany in the 1930s, but did manage to find a permanent safe haven, who were able to immigrate to the United States before the outbreak of war. And some of these soldiers, many of them young men, many of these new immigrants were able to become soldiers. They joined the American military. Some of them took advantage of their fluency in the German language and knowledge of German culture to become interrogators or to become intelligence personnel. And so some of them landed on D-Day or dropped as paratroopers, mainly to help the Allied forces, to help the forces of their new country, and to liberate their homelands. And for some of them, they were trying to find their own families.
Thanks, Becky. Allison, a question for you. What do you think the greatest misconception is when it comes to the intertwining of the history of World War II and the Holocaust?
I think the misconception is that they are not intertwined. Too often, especially here in the United States, we sometimes get caught up in the drama of World War II. This was a war that was documented so well through photos, through motion pictures. We've seen footage of the actual service members. We have watched the films that we talked about earlier, Band of Brothers, the miniseries, Saving Private Ryan. Even more recently, I found myself getting caught up in the new series, Masters of the Air. It's easy to be swept away in this epic story about good versus evil, about the so-called greatest generation. But we have to remember that when we're talking about D-Day or the Battle of the Bulge or the invasion of Sicily, it's not just about troop movements and airplanes. It's not just Sherman tanks. It is about what this war was being fought over, particularly in the European theater of operations. This was a war against a regime that was anti-Semitic and racist. And we cannot treat the Holocaust and World War II, those combat operations and support activities, as separate. If we're going to talk about World War II, we need to talk about the Holocaust.
Absolutely. And Allison, I want to share a comment we got from Mark. He writes, my uncle, John Jobst, landed at Normandy +3, fought in Battle of the Bulge, liberated Dachau, and won the Bronze Star for bravery in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Thanks so much for sharing that with us, Mark.
Thank you for sharing that. And if you have any information about him, you can go on our website, contact us, and share anything you may have about his story. Thank you.
And, you know, in our comments during the show, we have seen so many of you sharing your ties to D-Day and liberation and the Holocaust. And one really stood out to us. A woman, Debbie, shared that her father was with the 104th Infantry, which liberated Dora Mittelbau, a concentration camp, also called Nordhausen. And another commenter, also named Debbie, shared that he was part of the unit that liberated her father.
The Timberwolves, the 104th. Thank you so much. I think we're really excited after this program to go into the comments and read all of the things you're sharing. Please keep sharing these stories.
Yeah, and that's a really amazing connection to see in the comments, right? That one of your relatives was a liberator and the other liberated. That's really amazing to hear. Larry also writes, as tears fall down my face, my dad, Auschwitz survivor, every day blessed America for the opportunity they provided him and those he brought here after the war. I feel like you can hear in that some of the echoes of the ways that Eddie and Al talk about their experiences as well. Thank you so much, Becky and Allison, for joining us tonight. It's been a real pleasure talking with you. To our audience, it's been wonderful to see these comments coming in. As we mentioned earlier, you can visit Arlington National Cemetery and pay your respects to these men, as well as many other service members from World War II and numerous other Holocaust survivors. For those outside of the DC area, Arlington hosts many virtual educational programs like this one, where you can learn more about the stories of individuals laid to rest there. We will share links in the chat where you can learn more. To learn more about the history of the Holocaust from an American perspective, we invite you to visit our special exhibition, Americans in the Holocaust. It's on display right now at the museum in DC. We'll also share a link in the live chat where you can view the online exhibition. I'd like to take a moment and thank Eddie Willner's son, Al. Al is also a veteran and was inspired by his father to serve. I would like to end tonight's program with some words from Al.
As this program is being conducted on the eve of the 80th anniversary of D-Day, really our profound gratitude to soldiers who served and their families and the sacrifices that were made. That service and that sacrifice is the reason I'm here to give this talk today. Thank you.